My name is Andrew Betwain. I'm the managing editor of fundoperator.com, and today I'm joined by Deon Pillay, head of marketing operations and co-chair of Legit, Legal and General Investment Managers Employee Diversity and Inclusion Resource Group. Deon will be speaking at our Fund Operator Summit Europe in the third day on November the 17th and the Fund HR Talent and Inclusion Forum. He'll be speaking on a panel talking about invigorating constructive dialogues, strategies to discussing diversity and equality issues to create an inclusive environment. Deon, hello, how are you?
Hi, Andrew, and I'm great, thank you. And thank you for having me on the platform today.
It's lovely to have you here. So I'm going to dive into the questions straight away and get us going. So my first question is, D&I has become much more important to companies over the past few years, and many are still struggling with certain concepts or what could be construed as maybe they're moving too slowly. What would your advice and advice on methodologies be to those that are hesitant to progress in making D&I a key facet of their operational structures?
That's a great question, Andrew, and one we hear quite often. I think DEI, like you say, has become a business fundamental. It's not just a tick box exercise anymore, as we know the importance of DEI, especially in generating revenue and new business. We know that clients, especially now, are very cautious around investing in companies specifically, but also where they're spending their money, especially if companies aren't seen to be diversity inclusive. So the challenge we have with most companies is the belief that they don't always have certain elements of diversity within their company, and therefore they don't cater for those individuals, because certain things aren't visible, like sexual identity or gender identity sometimes are not quite visible. What I would advise companies to do is think about intersectionality and how you can use intersectionality to really bring your DEI strategy to life. So if you cater for all aspects of diversity through an intersectional lens, you can actually have a much more engaged conversation, because lots of companies still focus on three traditional things, right? They focus on ethnicity, which has now become a big talking point. The focus was on gender about 5-6 years ago, and that's still ongoing conversation, which is really, really important. And then it's the LGBT piece, which is also still in the frame. And those are the three elements they tend to focus on, forgetting about health and well-being, which has become really important for most employees, specifically after the COVID pandemic, which is kind of ongoing. And then we also have the challenge around socioeconomic mobility and ensuring that we give the same sort of opportunities to people that come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And then neurodiversity is also playing a really, really important part in the space at the moment. So how do you make sure that you're catering for all types of employees within your organization, and intersectionality helps address that. So when you're doing your events, for example, making sure that you have an intersectional lens on your events, inviting different people with different views to the table to discuss the topics. The other key thing is policy, and this is a quick win for most businesses. Make sure your policies are inclusive, right? Even the workplace environment that you're creating, make sure you think about it from an inclusive perspective, specifically for people who are neurodiverse, and how you sort of set up your workplace. Simple things like lighting, noise, etc. plays a really, really important part. And you asked about why people aren't having the discussion. How do you create that discussion and debate within the organization? I guess there's a two-pronged approach that we take. One is the top-down approach, and the second is the bottom-up approach. But we're still seeing what we call a sticky middle, and I'll come to that in a second. The top-down approach is making sure your senior leadership are really engaged, and they are the sponsors of these networks, because diversity, equity, inclusion has, for us, become a sort of strategic pillar. And what we've made sure is every single person's objective now contains an element of diversity, equity, and inclusion in it. So for us, it's important that we are measuring the impact that people are having through their daily interactions in the business and changing our culture at Legal and General. So for that, it's starting the debate from the top and making sure people have permission to, one, get things wrong, provided they're learning from getting things wrong. Because when people are too scared to start the conversation, that's when people stop talking. Now, we know we live in a very PC environment at the moment where people are very scared to get things wrong, specifically around gender and race. And therefore, we don't have those robust conversations that we're having in the past. I say giving people permission and then encouraging them to attend events, because we know that most people and most companies right now are resource constrained, and therefore they don't feel like they have the time to engage in diversity, equity, inclusion. They see it as a very fluffy operational type thing or an HR thing. What we should see it as the business imperative, and people that don't want to engage in these conversations because they don't see the importance of it, When you turn it on its head and say it's about business growth and business strategy, you then start to see people take a very different view on diversity, equity, inclusion, and why it's important for them to get involved. So that's the two parts that I talked about, sort of the sticky middle and getting them to change, and then the top down. The bottom up is really empowering your people within the organization to start having those conversations in a safe environment. So by creating these networks within the organization that we have a community within a community, that makes sense. So even though we have the overall strategy, we have each of the diverse networks specifically catering for those individuals who identify in a certain way and their allies to come together and really have robust conversations on matters that impact them and things that they're concerned about. I think that's a great way of starting that journey in empowering your people to have those conversations.
Some really interesting points there, Deon, and I particularly found that part about interesting about bringing other people in. So I wanted to, you mentioned some of your own thoughts there, and I wanted to sort of build on that in ways that, for my next question, can you talk us through some of your own personal strategies for not starting the conversations, but maybe sort of invigorating them and getting them really going and getting down to that nitty gritty, into that granular, and trying to bring people in and change minds, that sort of thing?
Yeah, the first thing is the power of storytelling. So I love telling a story, but I like to start with my personal story, because when you make it personable and relatable, it connects with people. And then it makes people think differently, because we hear lots of sort of the standard stories of other people and no one really cares. But when it's somebody close to you and it's someone that you work with, a colleague, sometimes these stories have much more power and they can really change and win hearts and minds. Was it Heinz? Hearts and minds, because I think that's sort of the starting point. Also, it's okay to have different views as long as you're respectful, right? So I'm quite controversial in my thinking sometimes. I love to bring events to the table that are very different, where we challenge things like sexuality, gender, and religion, and the connection between the three things. People go, oh, that's a topic we don't really want to talk about, but we should talk about it, because the more we talk about it, the more we educate people and can maybe change how people perceive things to be, right? We know that religion plays a massive part, especially in gender identity and sexuality, and we've seen that. And even politics sometimes comes into play, right? We've seen it specifically now in the trans community, and how religion and sort of the politics are causing disruption and creating this narrative which is not helpful for the trans community. So I think it's about being controversial but respectful, bringing different topics, bring that intersectional topic as well. So we do some great stuff that we've been doing around gender identity, sexuality, and parents and carers, right? Because if we can educate the parents around the challenges the LGBTQ plus community face, knowing that more than 5% of kids now identify as non-binary or trans, and we've seen that upward trend, it's really important to get parents comfortable with how to support their kids should they come out to them, either as trans, non-binary, or LGBTQ plus, right? So bringing those topics that are different. The other one that I've been working on at the moment is looking at how the British Empire has impacted the LGBT community. And this is looking at it more from mostly in African countries, so Black people, because there's still this denial that Black people exist, right? Because we know that in lots of African countries, because of cultural nuances and religion, they don't see it as being a thing or something that they are not comfortable with having the conversation and debate about. So bringing those sort of topics to the table is what drives conversation and thinking and debate, because healthy debate is good. Because if we just step back and create comfortable allyship programs, we focus on all the touchy-feely stuff of LGBT inclusion, not much is going to change. I mean, I get in trouble for saying this sometimes, but I think the word ally is very passive. We need to move away from ally and say, whilst allies are important, I think advocates are a much better term to use, because it shows somebody who's actively taking control and championing and challenging thinking. So moving the dial from allyship, which I see as passive, to advocacy is another way that we can really have a debate around what does it actually mean? Because we all say, oh, we're allies. I'm an ally for the trans community. But what does it actually mean? Just saying, wearing a fancy lanyard and saying, oh, look, I have a trans lanyard. That's great to start internally showcasing that you are supportive, or putting your pronouns on your signature is another great way of showing support. But when you're actively marching with the trans community, like, Trans Pride this weekend, and saying, I want to be counted, if you're going to be attacking the trans community, you've got to come through me first, right? Because I'm not going to have this on my watch. And it's those sort of uncomfortable conversations that will really make a difference in organizations, I think.
That's a very interesting point. And you kind of segued into my next question, which is really good. Thank you very much. So the dialogue around diversity and inclusion topics can be hijacked by other topics, or it might struggle to get started in the first place. How would you recommend creating a space where we can have these awkward conversations, we can have these uncomfortable truths being spoken? How do you create a space that's open and safe for those conversations in a workplace to happen?
And that's another great question, and one we see happen over and over again, specifically when bigger topics come to the front, like when Black Lives Matter, which is really, really important topic. We found a massive pivot away from other aspects of DEI and a focus solely on increasing equality for our Black colleagues, which is really, really, I still say, very important. The same thing with gender. When gender came onto the platform 5 years ago plus, we saw this massive uptake in talking about gender identity, and it was sad because it was driven by policy and by government. But equally, what we saw was businesses start to do the tick box exercise of promoting women into these really senior roles without giving them the toolkits to be successful, to prove a point that they would fail. And when women did fail, they said, "Well, we gave them the opportunity. Look, it doesn't work." What we've now seen, and thankfully, because we're talking about diversity and we're talking about culture and ethnicity a bit more these days, we've seen an absolute pivot towards promoting of diverse talent from an ethnic minority background, specifically the Black community. And we are seeing the right tools being put in place, the sponsorship coming from senior leadership, etc. But going back to your question around the conversation and the safe spaces, I think it's really important that whilst we talked about intersectionality in the very beginning, that we still have these networks that exist specifically for these communities, be it LGBT, be it ethnicity, socioeconomic mobility, gender balance, etc. Because you want to have those safe spaces that you talk about, where people can come together who are like-minded and their allies to really have debate and discussion, and to also talk about the challenges that they're currently facing in a way that they can be candid and honest with each other and get that support, right? Because when you don't create that environment, people tend to keep quiet and bottle things in, or we don't have the conversation. The second really impactful way of addressing it at a wider company level is having those cultural conversations where we bring topics and we talk about the countries that we're doing business in, for example, where we want to understand the culture, every aspect of the culture, from the food, the people, the religious views, etc. Because it's really important, especially when you are growing your business in international spaces. It's about preparing your workforce to work abroad, but equally to understand their colleagues in global jurisdictions, right? Because if you can't appreciate the cultural nuances of somebody, then you can start to form unconscious biases against those individuals. I remember going for an interview once, and the person was looking at the table constantly, and I didn't realize that in the Japanese culture, it's disrespectful for a female to look you in the eye when they're speaking. I thought, God, what an awful interview. I don't want to work for the organization. So it just kind of shows you that if we don't actually engage in conversations and learn more about the cultural nuances, we start to form all these biases, which then impacts our DEI strategies, right? So creating a safe space for people to have those conversations is absolutely important. It's also about addressing it at a more higher level and bringing up those cultural conversations. And the last piece, which I found really shocking, is 95% of companies don't provide guidance to the employees who they send to work abroad. So imagine you're going to a country which is not LGBTQ plus friendly. You have no idea of the laws or regulations in those countries, and suddenly you're working there, something goes wrong, you don't know who to reach out to. So I think the approach now is not just thinking about the LGBTQ plus community, but thinking widely across your diverse workforce. What information should you be giving them when you send them to work in those new environments, right? It doesn't matter whether they're LGBTQ plus, especially trans, or females specifically going to work in certain countries where may not be as safe for them. It's being really sort of upfront, having the policies to protect them, but equally informing them in advance, and also giving them the option then not to work in those countries, right? Because we know that lots of people are sent off to work on assignment. They don't realize the impact on the individual because, like I said, sexual identity sometimes is not disclosed. People don't feel comfortable. and they may be actually put into an unsafe environment to work. So starting those conversations with your HR partners, with the senior leaders, and most importantly with your colleagues is really important, as long as everything is done in a respectful manner, and creating the safe spaces allows people to be really candid in what they bring to the table as well.
It's a really interesting point. So my final question for you is, in your own role as head of marketing operations, how have you worked on being this quote unquote constructive in your approach to D&I? And what advice would you give to others who are struggling in their own roles to begin this process, and where they find their little niche to be this ally, this advocate, or stand up for their own rights?
Yeah, I guess it's called marginal gains, like thinking about, what are the low-hanging fruit as people talk about. And for me, the operational lead was, okay, what do we currently have? What do we have the power to control internally? Before we go outside and make a massive noise, let's consult our people. Let's ask our people, what do they want from the organization? It's pointless building a DEI strategy and a structure if nobody's supportive of it, right? So let's have the conversation. What do people want? And which aspects of diversity do we want to focus on? So it has to start somewhere. We found that starting with, because gender was already on the table from 5 years ago, but starting with LGBTQ+, we found was the most inclusive strand, because it covered a number of other identities. It looked at ethnic minorities who might be LGBTQ+. It looked at mental health and well-being, because we know the challenges are felt more strongly by the LGBTQ+ community. So building the framework around the LGBTQ+ community, but remembering the other marginalized groups that we wanted to focus on as well, we were able to put our strategy in place. So starting with policy change, getting the HR people in the room and the specialists, and consulting other organizations. You have great organizations like Stonewall, Mermaids, Global Butterflies, who can come and help you in your policies. So for us, creating a trans inclusion policy was really important for us, because we had colleagues who identified as trans, and even if they didn't identify as trans, it was important to have the policy in place to attract the staff that you wanted to reflect society, right? That's the first part, getting policy right. And then senior leader sponsorship is extremely important. It's a top-down visibility of people really championing it and saying, we are doing this because we genuinely care about it, not just tick box exercise. Very, very important. It's then getting people who are passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also giving them the time in their day-to-day jobs to actually do this as part of their day job as well, right? Because we all want to get involved in DEI, but imagine doing an 8-hour job plus and then having to spend more time doing diversity and inclusion stuff. It can be draining. And to make it really sustainable, make sure when you have your co-chairs, your chair structures for the networks, you have a number of co-chairs instead. That way the load is shared and it's balanced. And the diversity of thinking also shapes the way the networks will grow and thrive. And representation is really, really important, especially for the LGBT perspective. It's making sure the gender balance right. Because if you don't have somebody who identifies as female, lesbian, or trans on the network, attracting that diverse group of people to the network is absolutely challenging. What we've seen in the city and in other industries, male-led networks, especially in the LGBT space, are not really successful. And that's because it doesn't attract the lesbian community and even the trans community sometimes. So it's making sure you think about the gender balance and ethnicity balance as well, as we talk about the other demographics in the DEI space. Because even when you start to create events, think about who's attending your events and making sure your panels are reflective of society. Because the minute you get that wrong, lots of speakers now will not attend. Like if someone says to me, we're having 4 white males speaking on a panel, and I'm like, well, no, I'm not going to be able to tick a box. Where's the female representation, right? Where's somebody else that's different from me? Where's their perspective coming on this panel? So I think it's really important we think about these things as we plan and shape our networks. And then it's about the ongoing commitment from the organization, right? It doesn't cost lots of money to do diversity, equity, inclusion. People think you need lots of money. The power of sharing stories, like I said, is such a simple resource. Use your people to share their stories, right? By giving them the right space and creating a culture that allows them to be authentic, to bring their whole selves to work, you will have an untapped amount of resource, will happily engage and share stories, will actively get involved in helping change and shape the culture for an organization through these networks. So utilize your resource, but also invest some money in shaping policy, in making sure you create the right workspace for individuals, the parents and carers policies, etc., make sure they're really inclusive of all aspects of people and how they live their lives. So I think that's really important. And then the last piece I would say is the sponsorship, making sure you have at a senior level somebody sponsoring individuals, not just from a DEI perspective, but from a career perspective, so that we can shape and build talent pools for the future. Because we keep hearing the narrative, oh, we can't find somebody who's Black to be in a senior role, or we can't find someone who ticks this box. And it's not about ticking boxes, it's about identifying and nurturing talent within the organization that helps lead to change for the future.
Brilliant answers there, Deon. I mean, I've learned so much in this call. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute pleasure hearing your thoughts on this. And if you are interested in hearing more of Deon's thoughts, please do join us in November in London for the Fund Operator Summit Europe's HR and Diversity Inclusion Forum, where Deon will be speaking about more on these topics. And there's a lot of topics to cover in D&I. So please do find more details on ClearPath Analysis' website for the event. And thank you very much to Deon. And thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew.